A peaceful morning suddenly turned into a nightmare when Angela, a black nun, was handing food to a homeless elderly woman and was abruptly stopped by 3 white police officers. With baseless, discriminatory accusations, they humiliated her by tying her to a streetlight in the middle of the road. But what these officers didn't realize was that their outrageous act had provoked one of the most powerful men at the Pentagon, setting off a chain of events that would turn all their lives upside down in an instant. How will these officers pay for their cruel, twisted game? Stay with us until the end of the story. But before we begin, share where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more gripping stories. Early in the morning, when the pale sunlight had yet to chase away the lingering chill of the mist, Angela stepped out of the church, her hands weighed down by heavy bags of food for the homeless. To her, compassion was the only way to fight against the shadows of injustice that lurked in this city. At the familiar street corner, old Martha, a black homeless woman who had once been a devoted teacher but now drifted on the fringes of life, sat curled up against the cold. Angela gently wrapped a scarf around her frail shoulders, her voice soft with concern. "It's freezing out here. Keep yourself warm. I hope this food helps a little." Martha looked up, her wrinkled lips curling into a weak but grateful smile. But the warmth of that moment was short-lived. The sudden screech of tires shattered the quiet morning as a patrol car came to an abrupt stop. 3 police officers stepped out. Leading them was Lieutenant Blake, followed closely by Curtis and Jameson. Angela knew them well. Men like these had never hidden their disdain for people like her. Their eyes were sharp with judgment, filled with open contempt. Blake stepped closer, his voice laced with mockery. "What are 2 black folks doing out here this early? Trying to turn this corner into some kind of gathering spot for your kind?" Angela held her ground, her voice cold but firm. "I'm just giving her breakfast." Blake scoffed and moved in, scrutinizing the bags of food as if searching for something illicit. Curtis chimed in, his tone dripping with derision. "Typical. Always helping each other, gathering in little groups, then crying about discrimination. No wonder this neighborhood keeps going to hell." Before Angela could react, Jameson lunged forward, yanking the bags from her hands and spilling their contents onto the pavement. Vegetables rolled across the sidewalk. Loaves of bread tumbled into the dirt. Blake watched with a smirk, his voice thick with mock pity. "See? You are gathering, encouraging these vagrants to ruin the image of this city. Did you really think that wearing a nun's habit would make you untouchable?" The absurdity of the accusation stunned Angela. She barely had time to process it before Jameson and Curtis seized her wrists, wrenching them behind her back and shoving her against the cold metal of a streetlight. Pain shot through her arms, but it was nothing compared to the searing helplessness and fury that burned inside her. Blake wasn't finished. He took a rope and bound her tightly to the pole, ensuring she couldn't move. Then, as if to strip away the last shred of her dignity, he reached for the silver necklace around her neck, the one with the small cross, a sacred keepsake from her mother. He yanked it off. The tiny cross hit the pavement with a faint clink, a small sound, yet it ripped through Angela's heart like a blade. Blake tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before playing saint to these homeless nobodies." Angela lifted her gaze, her eyes blazing with defiance. There were no words to fully capture the cruelty and injustice of this moment. She looked down at the silver cross lying in the dirt, her chest tightening with anguish. Was this the price she had to pay for kindness? But even in that moment, as they tried to break her, Angela knew one thing. They could take away her freedom, humiliate her, strip her of everything she had. But they would never take her faith. They would never erase her belief in justice. And they would never destroy the kindness she carried in her heart. Just as Blake and his men's mocking laughter filled the empty street, a bright red sedan screeched to a sudden halt, shattering the quiet of the early morning. The door swung open, and out stepped a woman in a sharp business suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun, Her face was striking, sharp, determined, with eyes that burned with defiance. Jessica Morgan, a renowned investigative journalist, a woman who was always at the heart of the storm, exposing the darkest injustices for the world to see. Blake's smirk faltered for a brief second as he saw Jessica approaching. His momentary hesitation was quickly masked by disdain. He squared his shoulders, making a show of authority, glancing sideways at his men as if seeking their backing. Curtis and Jameson let out loud, derisive laughs, clearly treating Jessica's arrival as nothing more than an amusing interruption. Curtis sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey, Morgan, why don't you head back to your little office and scribble your cheap tabloid stories? This is police business. Stay out of it." Jessica's gaze locked onto Blake's, cold and unwavering. Every move she made was deliberate, precise, fearless. Without a word, she pulled her phone from her pocket, holding it up as if ready to record. Her voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "If you're following the law, then you shouldn't have a problem with me filming, right, Lieutenant Blake?" Blake's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged. His tone turned mocking, but there was an edge of irritation beneath it. "Who do you think you're intimidating, Jessica? I could have you arrested right now for obstructing police work. And trust me, you wouldn't like that experience." Jessica arched an eyebrow, a hint of a smirk playing on her lips. Fearless, daring. "Oh, Blake, I've heard that threat too many times before. But soon enough, you'll see what happens when you act like you're above the law." For a moment, Blake had no response. Curtis and Jameson exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to pushing around people like Angela and Martha, people who had no power to fight back. But Jessica was different. She was a threat, someone who wouldn't be silenced, someone who had the platform, the voice, and the courage to expose them for what they were. A flicker of frustration passed over Blake's face before it hardened into rage. His voice, thick with venom, came out in a near growl. "You think you're special? You're just another loudmouth wasting your time defending people who contribute nothing but problems. If you care so much, why don't you take them all home with you?" Jessica didn't respond right away. Her expression darkened for just a moment, a brief flicker of something deeper, rawer, a painful memory buried beneath layers of defiance. Her brother, a young black man who had lost his life in an encounter just like this, killed for nothing more than the color of his skin. For a fleeting second, her voice wavered, but when she spoke, it was razor-sharp. "No, Blake, I'm not special, but I have nothing left to lose. You took someone from me once. I won't let you do it again." And with that, she pressed the record button, lifting her phone higher, capturing every detail of the scene. Her eyes burned with determination, unshaken, unyielding. Blake and his men had thought they were dealing with just another powerless nun and a forgotten homeless woman. But now, they realized they were facing something far greater, someone who refused to be afraid, someone who would bring their actions into the light for the world to see, someone who would never back down. The moment Jessica hit record, a flash of unrestrained fury flickered in Blake's eyes. He stormed forward, reaching out to snatch the phone from her hands, his voice thick with arrogance and threat. "Who do you think you are, holding that damn phone up? This is official police business. You're not allowed to film." Jessica swiftly stepped back, evading his grasp. Her face remained steely, her eyes unwavering. There wasn't a shred of fear in her stance. She met Blake's gaze head-on, her voice cold and firm. "You're breaking the law, Blake. I don't think you want another lawsuit on your hands." Her words struck like a blade to his pride. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched, and he advanced with even more aggression. Curtis and Jameson burst into mocking laughter, stepping closer to her, their movements deliberate, closing in, forming a suffocating circle around her. Curtis scoffed, his gaze flicking toward her phone with disdain. "Let me guess, planning to run back and write another sob story about racial injustice?" Jameson sneered, his tone laced with pure contempt. "People like you just use this nonsense to get attention, acting like some kind of hero. If you love these worthless nobodies so much, why don't you take them all home instead of stirring up trouble here?" The morning air had once been calm, but now it was thick with tension. Without warning, Blake lunged at Jessica, grabbing for her phone. They struggled, their movements fueled by rage. His, violent and desperate. Hers, unyielding, determined to protect the only evidence that could expose this injustice. Jessica knew exactly what she was holding in her hands. It wasn't just a recording, it was proof. It was the voice of the truth, something she had sworn to defend at all costs. The memory of her brother's death seared through her, reminding her why she could never back down. Meanwhile, Angela was still bound tightly to the streetlight, her breathing growing shallower with each second. Her chest heaved, her body trembling before a violent coughing fit took hold of her. The tight ropes bit into her skin, leaving behind raw, burning marks. And then, as if a dam had burst inside her lungs, the familiar sensation of an asthma attack crashed over her like a tidal wave, draining her of what little strength she had left. Panic set in. Angela gasped, struggling to pull in air, her fingers instinctively reaching toward her pocket where she always kept her inhaler. But her hands, bound cruelly behind her, were useless. The world around her blurred, her vision swimming as hot tears mixed with the crushing weight in her chest. She tried to call for help, but only weak, strangled sounds escaped her lips, lost amid the chaos. Not far away, old Martha had been watching. The elderly woman, frail yet determined, forced her aching body forward. She saw the distress in Angela's eyes, the way she gasped for breath, and a sharp urgency ignited within her. With trembling hands, Martha reached into Angela's pocket, pulling out the inhaler she so desperately needed. She fumbled, her fingers shaking as she brought it to Angela's lips, helping her take a breath. One inhale, then another. Slowly, the tight grip around Angela's lungs began to loosen. Through it all, the officers remained indifferent. They didn't care. Blake was too focused on his battle with Jessica, too blind to the suffering unraveling before him. He turned, sneering at Martha with the same careless disdain, seeing her and Angela as nothing more than meaningless figures. Two black lives unworthy of a second thought. But his indifference had gone unnoticed by no one. The commotion had drawn the attention of the neighborhood. Residents emerged from their homes, stepping closer, their faces etched with a new kind of emotion. Not fear, but anger. The injustice unfolding before them was no longer something they could ignore. And then, as if answering a silent call, phones began to rise into the air. One by one, cameras pointed straight at Blake and his men, capturing everything, every smirk, every act of cruelty, every second of this moment, documented. Blake spun around, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. A flicker of something else, fear, flashed in his eyes. He barked, his voice desperate, grasping for the last scraps of his authority. "What the hell are you all looking at? Get out of here before I arrest every damn one of you for interfering with police work!" Jessica seized the moment. Raising her voice, she turned to the growing crowd, her words cutting through the air like thunder. "These are the men who claim to uphold the law, but look at them. They act like nothing more than common thugs." Her voice carried through the street, igniting something powerful. More phones were lifted, more cameras recorded. In a matter of seconds, this quiet street had transformed into something unstoppable, a battleground for truth, a reckoning for justice. No one could look away now. No one could pretend they didn't see. As the chaos around them intensified, Angela's breath remained unsteady. Her chest burned, every inhale sharp and painful, but her mind was slowly clearing, thanks to Martha's timely intervention. The crowd had thickened, murmurs rolling through them like waves, their eyes filled with anger and empathy. Every phone was now pointed at Angela, capturing the image of a woman bound to a streetlight, her wrists raw from the ropes, her eyes blurred with tears. Beside her stood an elderly woman, once cast aside by society, yet the only one who had dared to step forward when Angela needed help the most. It was a scene of undeniable injustice, but also one of quiet resilience, a testament to kindness and unyielding strength. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new sound cut through the air, subtle yet commanding, like the ticking of a clock heralding an inevitable reckoning. The soft hum of tires gliding over asphalt. A sleek black luxury sedan, polished yet understated, rolled steadily toward the commotion. Its presence was an immediate contradiction to the chaos unfolding on the street. Calm, deliberate, in complete control. It came to a smooth stop at the curb, and after a brief pause, the door swung open. A man stepped out. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit with an effortless precision, moving with an unhurried confidence that suggested he either wasn't aware of the suffocating tension crackling around him, or simply didn't care. All eyes turned to him. The air shifted, thick with a different kind of silence, one of anticipation, of uncertainty. The man was tall, his features sharp and chiseled, his gaze cold, yet carrying an undeniable weight, an authority that needed no words to be recognized. It wasn't just confidence. It was the quiet, absolute command of someone who belonged to the rare breed of men accustomed to wielding real power, the kind of power that made others hesitate before daring to cross them. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved forward, placing himself directly between Jessica and Blake, right in front of the furious, unhinged officer who had lost all control of the situation. His gaze flicked briefly toward Angela, taking in the cruel restraints, then returned to Blake. And when his eyes settled on the officer, they held no anger, no theatrics, just cold, cutting contempt. Blake immediately sensed that this was no ordinary bystander. There was something about the man's composure, the ease with which he inserted himself into the scene, the unwavering stillness in his stance. It was the kind of presence only possessed by those who operated in the highest circles of power. An uneasy feeling twisted in Blake's gut. His instincts screamed danger. Unconsciously, he took a small step back. But arrogance, a lifetime of unchecked authority, forced him to puff out his chest in defiance. He refused to fully retreat. He still had power here, didn't he? What he failed to realize was that every single movement, every flicker of bravado, was being measured, scrutinized with unnerving precision by the man before him, calculated, noted, judged. The stranger didn't immediately speak. Instead, his gaze shifted to Angela, then to Jessica, offering her a brief nod of acknowledgement, an unspoken gesture of recognition. Only then did he reach into his suit pocket. He moved without haste, retrieving his phone with the same unsettling composure, tapping a few buttons before bringing it to his ear. "We have a serious violation at Ashland and 9th. Immediate intervention required." It was a simple sentence, calm, almost casual, but to Blake, it might as well have been a death sentence. The words echoed in his head, slashing through his last remnants of control. He froze, his entire body tensed, his breath suddenly shallow. Sweat slicked his palms as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. Because in that moment, he realized, this wasn't just some bystander, not some journalist looking for a story, not an activist trying to make noise. No, this was something else entirely. His eyes locked onto the man's face, and then, like a bolt of lightning, the recognition struck. His blood ran cold. He is Alexander Price, senior advisor to the Department of Justice, a man whose phone calls didn't just carry weight. They dismantled careers, erased authority, and crushed those foolish enough to believe themselves untouchable. Blake felt the ground shift beneath him. He was no longer in control. He was no longer the hunter. At some point, without realizing it, he had become the prey. The air on the quiet morning street turned unbearably tense as Alexander Price's calm yet icy voice rang out. His sharp gaze swept over the frozen officers, lingering deliberately on Blake's now pale face, filled with barely concealed dread. But just as the suffocating silence threatened to consume everything, the sudden roar of an approaching police car shattered the stillness. Tires screeched against asphalt, piercing through the moment, like a blade slicing through glass. The vehicle skidded to an abrupt halt. The doors flew open, and from inside, Officer Darnell Davis stepped out, his expression blazing with fury. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark skin contrasting with the sharpness of his gaze, fierce yet familiar, carrying an unmistakable sense of integrity. The moment he emerged, his eyes locked onto Angela. And when he saw her, gasping for breath, wrists red and swollen from the cruel restraints, the anger inside him surged like an uncontainable force. Without hesitation, Davis strode straight to Angela, reaching for the multi-tool at his belt. He swiftly and carefully cut through the plastic ties, freeing her from their grip. Angela trembled as she inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Her eyes shimmered, a mix of overwhelming relief and the weight of all the pain she had endured. Davis held her gaze for a moment, as if searching for the right words. But in the end, he simply nodded, firm, reassuring, a silent promise that she was safe now. Then he turned, and for the first time, he faced Blake directly. Blake's expression twisted from tension to outright fury as he took a step forward, as if clinging to whatever authority he had left. But Davis didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward as well, closing the space between them, with purposeful finality. His voice, though controlled, carried the weight of seething rage beneath it. "You've gone too far, Blake. I warned you. I told you this day would come. But you never listened." Davis took a deep breath, forcing himself to rein in the storm raging inside him. His eyes swept across the faces around him, filled with disappointment, with frustration. "I reported your behavior more times than I can count, but no one ever listened. You all thought you were untouchable, that you could stand above the law, abuse innocent people just because of the color of their skin. But not this time. This time, I won't let any of you walk away from this." His voice rang out like steel against stone, unyielding, definitive. But behind the anger, there was something else, a deep, unshakable sorrow. This wasn't just about one incident. It was years, decades of witnessing injustice flourish behind the shield of a badge, a weight that had crushed him for too long. Beyond the growing circle of bystanders, the crowd continued to press in, their silent outrage turning into something more, something unstoppable. Phones remained raised, still recording every word, every movement. The moment had expanded beyond the street, beyond those present. It was spreading. A reckoning was unfolding, and everyone could feel it. Blake took an involuntary step back, his fists clenched, his entire body rigid with barely contained rage. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to feeling powerless, and he especially wasn't used to being challenged by his own colleague. Davis had always stayed quiet before. He had never openly opposed him. That silence had allowed Blake to operate without consequence. But now, that silence was gone. Curtis and Jameson exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, the realization dawning like a slow, creeping horror. They had taken this too far, and there was no turning back. This was no longer a situation they could control. All the while, Alexander Price stood in the background, his expression unreadable, his stance effortlessly composed. He observed every reaction, every hesitation, absorbing every detail without a word. His phone remained connected, the call still active. On the other end, the Attorney General was listening to everything unfold. Price's lips curled ever so slightly. His gaze, cold and absolute, met Blake's one last time, a silent confirmation of what the officer already knew. There was no way out of this. Blake's career and his power was already gone, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. All eyes were fixed on Alexander Price as he slowly advanced toward Blake. His voice remained composed, yet beneath that calm exterior lay an unseen force, one so powerful that even men like Blake, long accustomed to unchecked arrogance, couldn't ignore the creeping unease settling in their bones. Price came to a halt, his gaze cold as steel, locking onto Blake like a predator assessing its prey. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, an invisible coil tightening around every suppressed emotion in the air. Then, without hurry, he raised his phone. His finger brushed lightly against the screen, activating the speaker, ensuring that every person present could hear the words about to be spoken. The tension reached an unbearable peak, so fragile that even a single breath could shatter it all. A deep, commanding voice came through the receiver, clear and precise, carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Price, what's happening?" A faint smile played on Price's lips, but his eyes never left Blake and his men, as if ensuring that not a single word he was about to say would be lost on them. "General Turner, I'm at the scene of a severe abuse of power. Your sister Angela has just been forcibly restrained and publicly humiliated by Officer Blake and his team." An unnatural silence followed, a silence so dense, so absolute, that it felt like the very air had been sucked from the street. Blake's face drained of color. Curtis and Jameson stood motionless, their expressions frozen in disbelief, their minds struggling to process the devastating truth they had just heard. Even Davis turned abruptly to Angela, his eyes widening in shock. And Angela, stunned, her breath catching in her throat, stared ahead, momentarily paralyzed. She had spent her entire life shielding this truth, living in quiet defiance of her family's influence, choosing humility over privilege. And now, in a single moment, that veil had been torn away. Her fingers instinctively tightened around Martha's frail hand. Though her body was still weak from the asthma attack, though her breaths remained uneven, fear no longer coiled itself around Blake. What unsettled her now was what was to come. She had never wanted her family's name to serve as a shield, had never sought immunity through power. But the truth was out now, and she knew. Nothing would ever be simple again. Blake stood rooted to the ground, his mind spiraling into chaos. He had always believed he was in control, that he dictated the flow of every situation. But now, the reality of his mistake crashed down on him like a towering wave. His eyes flickered wildly. His breath grew shallow, panic clawing at his chest. And then, like a blade slicing through his mind, the name struck him. General Kenneth Turner. A name that carried weight like an unshakable force of nature. The head of the Pentagon's Strategic Command. A man whose influence stretched far beyond Blake's comprehension. A man whose power was not just feared, but obeyed. And he was the brother of the very woman Blake had so brazenly degraded. Curtis and Jameson, standing just behind Blake, were no better off. The realization hit them just as hard, their faces ghostly pale, eyes darting between each other, searching for an escape that did not exist. Their hands fidgeted, their breathing ragged, their gazes pleading toward their superior, as if waiting for a lifeline, for some way to undo what had been done. But there was no way out. Blake's mouth went dry. Words formed and died before reaching his tongue, choking on the sheer weight of the disaster he had just orchestrated. He had built his authority on fear, on power, on his ability to manipulate and intimidate. But now, in the face of true power, power beyond his control, it all crumbled to nothing. The conversation between Price and the man on the other end concluded swiftly, but the damage had already been done. Blake and his men didn't need further explanation to grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe they now faced. Price lowered his phone, slipping it back into his pocket with practiced ease. His gaze, sharp as a blade, settled once more on Blake, and in a voice as steady as it was final, he delivered the words that sealed it all. "I warned you, Blake. You and your men believed yourselves to be the law, but in reality, you're nothing more than blind abusers of power. Today, that ends." The words cut deep, severing the last thread of illusion Blake had clung to. He felt it, felt the ground shift beneath him, felt the cold seep into his veins, felt the weight of inevitability crush down upon his shoulders. His knees threatened to buckle under him. The crowd, which had grown exponentially, was no longer just a gathering of witnesses. They were an unrelenting force. Phones remained raised, recording every second of his humiliation, but beyond the cameras, it was their eyes, furious, condemning, unflinching, that burned into him. There was no escaping them. Desperation clawed at him. He turned to Curtis and Jameson, searching for some semblance of support, for even a flicker of assurance. But all he received was silence. A silence so heavy, so absolute, it might as well have been his death knell. They, too, understood what was coming. The reality was clear. Their careers, their reputations, their very lives as they knew them were about to be obliterated under the weight of public fury and legal reckoning. Price took a slow step back, his unreadable expression finally softening as he turned to Angela. There was a quiet message in his gaze, a silent promise that she was no longer alone in this fight. Angela exhaled, steadying herself, trying to reclaim even a fragment of composure. But deep down, she knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. This was no longer just a personal reckoning. This was the spark that would ignite something far greater, something that would force the world to confront an ugly truth it could no longer ignore. Blake, a man who had always been certain of his authority and power, now stood frozen, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, cold sweat soaking through the back of his uniform. His eyes darted wildly, scanning his surroundings, but the whispers growing louder around him only tightened the grip of panic on his mind. The smartphones aimed at him from every direction felt like invisible weapons, each one a silent, unblinking witness to his downfall. And then, a powerful engine roared through the suffocating tension, its commanding presence slicing through the noise like a blade. The crowd instinctively parted, making way as a black military vehicle rolled onto the scene with unwavering purpose. It came to a precise stop at the center of the chaos, and after a brief, deliberate pause, its heavy steel door swung open with a solid, resounding clang. An unspoken signal, the first shot of an imminent reckoning. A towering figure emerged. His uniform was pristine, not a single wrinkle in sight. His posture was impeccable, exuding a quiet but undeniable dominance that made every person present fall into stunned silence. Even without a raised voice, his very presence commanded absolute respect. General Kenneth Turner, the head of the Pentagon's Strategic Command, a name that alone was enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who had ever heard it. His gaze, sharp as a blade, swept across the scene in mere seconds, yet with such precision that it felt as though time itself had slowed to accommodate him. Then, his eyes landed on Angela. His expression remained composed, but when he saw the angry red marks still imprinted on her wrists from the restraints, something shifted. A fire, quiet but deadly, flashed behind his steel-cold eyes. A restrained fury, simmering beneath his disciplined exterior. He said nothing at first. Instead, he stepped toward Angela, his movements controlled, his presence unwavering. His firm, steady hand rested on her shoulder, not just as a gesture of comfort, but as an unspoken shield, a silent promise that no harm would come to her again. Angela lifted her gaze to her brother, and in that moment, every wall she had built around herself crumbled. All the strength she had fought to maintain throughout this endless, harrowing morning collapsed beneath the weight of his presence. Her eyes welled up, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and exhaustion. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but her lips curved into a faint knowing smile. because she understood. His arrival meant the nightmare was over. Only then did General Turner turn to face Blake and his men. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The mere weight of his gaze was enough to crush any lingering defiance within them. Blake, who had once held himself with unchecked arrogance, now felt the suffocating pressure of a true authority, the kind he could never hope to challenge. There was no immediate explosion of rage from Turner, no aggressive display of power. Instead, there was something far more terrifying, a cold, calculated, absolute control. And that was what truly shook Blake to his core. For the first time, he understood. He was no longer the one holding the reins. Power had arrived, and the man standing before him now was the one holding the fate of them all in his hands. Turner's voice, low and deliberate, carried the weight of a final verdict. "You and your men have made a grave mistake. You laid your hands on my sister, an innocent woman, a woman who has spent her life helping others." Blake wanted to respond, to deny, to justify, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth was dry, his pulse thundering in his ears. Turner's gaze never wavered, drilling into him with an intensity that stripped away every false layer of authority he had ever wrapped himself in, exposing nothing but the hollow cowardice beneath. And before Blake could even begin to recover, Turner reached into his pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a military-issue phone. Under the unrelenting eyes of the crowd, he dialed with calm precision, his every movement as sharp and measured as the edge of a blade. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. And when Turner spoke, his words were a final, unshakable decree. "This is General Kenneth Turner. I am requesting an immediate special investigation from the Attorney General. What happened today cannot be allowed to happen again. These men must face the consequences of their abuse of power." Blake felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. His heartbeat slowed, each beat a heavy, ominous drum in his chest. Behind him, Curtis and Jameson stood as still as statues, their faces drained of color, their once arrogant confidence shattered beyond repair. Cold sweat dripped down their temples, their hands trembling at their sides. Because they knew. They all knew. Their lives, their careers, everything they had built under the illusion of invincibility, was now hanging by the thinnest of threads. And the man standing before them was the one holding the scissors. When images of Angela being tied up and humiliated in the middle of the street flooded the media, the city was instantly engulfed in a storm of rage, rising like an unstoppable tidal wave that no one had foreseen. Every screen, every street corner echoed with the people's seething outrage. No one could accept that a compassionate nun had become the victim of those who were supposed to protect her. Under this immense pressure, an undercurrent of turmoil began to surge within the city's inner political circles, a fierce internal battle between those desperate to protect the administration's image and those determined to fight for real justice. Early the next morning, inside the mayor's office, the air was thick with tension. Mayor Elaine Porter sat stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, struggling to maintain her composure, but failing to hide the unmistakable unease on her face. Across from her, Police Chief William Hendricks sat in brooding silence, his sharp gaze scanning the tense expressions around the room. In the corner, the large screen continued looping the footage of Angela tied to the streetlight, each replay another deep cut into the police department's already fragile reputation. No one spoke for the first few minutes, but the silence was heavier than the angry shouts echoing outside police headquarters. Finally, Mayor Elaine Porter was the first to break it. "We need to handle this quickly and quietly. The city cannot afford any more damage." Immediately, her senior political advisor reacted sharply, cutting off any thoughts of compromise. His voice was steely and firm, ringing through the room like an unflinching declaration. "Quickly? We can't just sweep this under the rug with a few empty apologies. The entire country is watching, and they will not forgive us if we try to cover anything up." Hendrix's eyes flashed with irritation as he turned to the senior advisor, then quickly shifted back to Porter, his frustration evident. "Madam Mayor, if we don't act fast, we'll lose complete control. But if we come down too hard, morale within the force will hit rock bottom." His words instantly triggered a heated debate. Some sided with Hendrix, arguing that the reputation of the entire police force would collapse if they allowed this incident to spiral any further. Others stood with Mayor Porter, demanding sweeping reforms to salvage the administration's credibility before it was too late. The tension in the room escalated, voices rising, the discussion teetering on the edge of chaos. But just as the meeting threatened to dissolve into disorder, Mayor Porter's personal phone buzzed violently, abruptly silencing the room. She quickly glanced at the message, and in an instant, the color drained from her face. When she looked up, her once authoritative voice was now tinged with unmistakable apprehension. "The Pentagon has spoken. General Kenneth Turner has personally requested the Attorney General to intervene. This is no longer our fight alone." The moment the name Kenneth Turner was spoken, Hendrix visibly paled. Whatever arguments he had crumbling in an instant. A deathly silence fell over the room. No one needed a reminder of who Kenneth Turner was. One of the most powerful figures in the military, a man known for his ruthless intolerance of injustice. And this time, his sister was the victim. The pressure in the room became suffocating. A young official, newly appointed, unable to contain his anxiety, blurted out the words trembling on everyone's lips. "So, it's over." No one corrected him. No one scolded him for his lack of professionalism, because they were all thinking the same thing. General Turner's authority was something they could neither challenge nor ignore, especially now, with public and media outrage reaching its boiling point. Hendrix struggled to keep his voice steady but failed miserably as he turned to the mayor, his uncertainty bleeding through every word. "What do we do now? This is no longer something we can contain internally. We need a solution. Immediately." Mayor Porter slowly rose to her feet, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking onto each individual. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer uncertain. It was cold, unyielding. "We have only one option: a full-scale reform. No concessions, no cover-ups, and we will not, under any circumstances, allow something like this to happen again." The moment those words were spoken, silence fell once more. But this time, it was not out of fear. It was the weight of undeniable realization. They all knew that the era of shielding each other through internal power had ended. The public, the media, the military, every entity with influence was now scrutinizing their every move. This was no longer just an internal issue. It had become a battle of conscience and morality, a battle they had delayed for too long and could no longer avoid. Hendrix gave a slow, heavy nod, exhaling deeply as though surrendering to the inescapable truth. There was no escape, no more maneuvering their way out of this. Angela, and countless others like her, were waiting for justice. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their own making. As for Blake's group, the moment he stepped out of the emergency meeting room, the reality of his downfall hit him like a freight train. Armed officers were advancing toward him with a ruthless precision that left no room for resistance. Curtis and Jameson stood rigidly beside him, their faces drained of all color, their breaths coming in rapid, uneven gasps as they finally grasped that the power they had once wielded had turned against them. Blake's eyes darted frantically, scanning for any possible escape, but there was none. Every exit had been cut off, every path closed. Within seconds, car doors swung open, and the heavy thud of approaching boots signaled the inevitability of what was to come. The press had already gathered, their cameras locked onto Blake and his men, capturing the precise moment that three officers, once feared and untouchable, were handcuffed in the very place that had once symbolized their dominance. The relentless clicking of camera shutters filled the air, and the blinding flashes of light ensured that this moment would be burned into history, an indelible mark of disgrace. Blake gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as the cold steel of the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, a suffocating reminder that his fate was now beyond his control. A slow, suffocating dread crept up his spine as he realized he had lost everything. He had never imagined this day would come so swiftly, so brutally. But now, no amount of regret could turn back time. It was over. Inside the interrogation room, the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on him like an invisible weight, making each breath feel heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the inescapable presence of judgment. Every second stretched unbearably long. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, sharp against the sterile silence. Blake instinctively lifted his head as the heavy steel door swung open. The officer escorting him didn't even glance in his direction, his voice devoid of emotion. "Get up." Blake hesitated, but he had no choice. He forced himself to rise, the cuffs biting into his wrists, his feet dragging heavily across the cold, unfeeling floor. Each step hammered in the reality that the authority he had once reveled in had dissolved into nothingness, leaving him exposed, just another man at the mercy of a system he once thought he controlled. As he entered the courtroom, hundreds of eyes bore down on him, an unspoken condemnation, their gazes carrying the full weight of anger, betrayal, and disgust. Blake had never been intimidated by a crowd before, but this time, the sheer intensity of their judgment sent a chill through him, making him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. On the large screen at the front of the courtroom, the damning footage played on a relentless loop. Angela bound to the streetlight, her silver necklace ripped away, the agony and helplessness in her eyes frozen in time. The images seared into Blake's mind, striking him like 1,000 sharp, unrelenting cuts. No matter where he looked, the truth was inescapable. He turned to Curtis and Jameson sitting beside him. Their faces were pale, drained of all defiance, their usual arrogance crushed beneath the weight of the moment. Sean Jameson, usually the most reserved of them all, looked the most broken, his hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table, his fingers gripping so tightly that his knuckles turned ghostly white. Nolan Blake had never thought he would witness this. His men, once untouchable, now reduced to shadows of their former selves, shattered by the relentless force of public outrage and the merciless march of justice. The judge's voice rang out, cutting through the charged silence, declaring the trial in session. Every word spoken felt like another nail sealing the coffin of Blake's career, another chisel carving away at the remnants of his illusion of power. Witness after witness took the stand, each statement reinforcing the deliberate, brutal nature of his and his team's actions. And then, Martha took the stand, the frail, elderly woman whom Angela had selflessly helped, now standing as the most damning witness in the courtroom. Her hands trembled as she gripped the railing, her voice wavering with the weight of her testimony. She recounted, moment by moment, the horror she had witnessed. Angela gasping for air, her body racked with pain, the sheer terror in her eyes as she struggled against an attack that could have taken her life. Her voice cracked, but she continued, each word striking the courtroom like a hammer, forcing those present to confront the full depth of the cruelty inflicted that day. The room fell into absolute silence. No one interrupted. No one moved. Because at that moment, no doubt remained. Blake and his men had not just abused their power. They had dehumanized those they were sworn to protect. And now, the world was watching as they faced the reckoning they had brought upon themselves. When all the evidence had been laid bare, Blake's attorney could no longer offer any convincing argument to salvage the case. Blake tried to take a deep breath, clinging to the last remnants of composure, but the feeble rebuttals from his defense now felt like nothing more than meaningless whispers drowned beneath the deafening roar of public outrage. As the final verdict was read, Blake shut his eyes. He had known this outcome was inevitable, yet hearing each word spoken so clearly by the judge made him truly grasp the weight of what he had done. He was no longer the powerful lieutenant, no longer the man others once feared. Now, he was simply Nolan Blake, a prisoner, a criminal, justly punished by the very system he had once manipulated to his advantage. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Blake turned his head, his gaze landing on Angela. She stood tall, her expression calm, her eyes locked onto him. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with an unwavering resolve. In that fleeting moment, Blake felt something he had never experienced before: failure, despair, and the crushing realization that his own arrogance and injustice had led him to this inescapable fate. The cold, gray walls of the prison cell felt like a reflection of Blake's own hollow existence. The dim, flickering yellow light overhead cast a dull glow, making the already suffocating space feel even more oppressive. He sat motionless, staring blankly at his own hands, the hands he once believed held power, control, and authority. Now they were empty, trembling with the weight of his downfall. For the first time in his life, he had to face himself, not as an officer, not as a man shielded by power, but as the sum of all his actions, stripped of everything he once thought defined him. Faces flashed through his mind, one after another, playing like an endless reel of guilt and regret. The suffering he had caused was no longer just a collection of distant memories. Each moment surfaced with brutal clarity. The black teenager sobbing in fear as he was handcuffed for merely walking through the wrong neighborhood at night. The man with his hands raised in surrender, eyes wide with terror as Blake aimed his gun at him. The mother with tear-streaked cheeks, begging him not to harm her son. Once he had viewed these memories as proof of his dominance, his control over the streets. Now they were nothing but relentless reminders of the pain he had inflicted. An unshakable torment pressing against his chest, suffocating him with every passing second. But the most agonizing memory was Angela, the nun he had humiliated, degraded, and robbed of something far more precious than just a piece of jewelry. He remembered the exact moment the silver cross fell to the pavement, the metallic clink reverberating in his ears like a church bell tolling in condemnation. Angela's eyes in that moment had held more than just anger or resentment. They had carried a deep, piercing sorrow, disappointment, a look that cut deeper than any words ever could, forcing him for the first time to recognize the cruelty of his own actions. She had not just lost a symbol of faith, he had taken something sacred, something he had never respected, never understood, until now, when he sat alone in this cell, stripped of everything, his own freedom reduced to nothing but a memory. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavier than the walls that confined him. Blake pressed his hands against his head, his mind spiraling under the weight of a guilt too immense to bear. He had spent years believing power made him untouchable, that his badge had shielded him from consequence. But now, these empty walls forced him to see the truth. He had never been above justice. He had merely been running from it. And now, there was no one left to protect him. No one to silence the voices of the people he had wronged. No one to shield him from the reality he had so desperately tried to ignore. There was no one left to blame. No excuses to make. Only the ghosts of his past, circling him like vultures, ensuring he would never again escape the weight of what he had done. Blake lowered his head, his hands trembling against his temples, trying in vain to push the memories away. But the more he tried to bury them, the clearer they became. For the first time, he understood what true regret felt like. Not just a moment of guilt, but an unbearable truth. The realization that he had once stood at a crossroads, that he had been given choices, and each time he had chosen the path of darkness, the path that led him here, to this inescapable prison of his own making. Each breath felt heavier, constricting his throat, drowning him in a sea of regret. Blake looked up, his eyes burning, his gaze landing on the cold steel bars separating him from the world beyond. A world he once ruled, a world he had once shaped with fear and oppression. But out there, beyond those bars, there were people like Angela, like Martha, like Jessica, people who had never stopped fighting, who had never surrendered to injustice. And he had been wrong, so devastatingly wrong, wrong beyond redemption. And now, the truth would never be buried. And justice would never let him rest. He lowered his head, silent tears falling onto the cold prison floor. And in that moment, he admitted to himself, he had lost to the power of compassion, to the force of justice, to the unwavering faith in goodness held by those he had once dismissed. For the first time, Blake understood that power was never absolute, never eternal, and the path he had chosen had only led him to destruction. He sat there, whispering as if confessing to himself, an overdue yet necessary realization, a truth he had denied for far too long. Even if it came too late, he could finally see it. What he had pursued was never real power, only an illusion masking the fear inside him. Blake inhaled deeply, accepting the punishment that was fast approaching. This was not the ending he had once envisioned, but it was the only fate he deserved. And in the crushing weight of his remorse, he knew that no matter how much time passed, no matter how much he regretted his actions, he would never be forgiven. But at the very least, he had now seen the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. That, in itself, was the harshest, most profound sentence he would carry for the rest of his days. Angela, too, had changed after the trial of Blake and his fellow officers. The heavy footsteps echoing through the old courthouse tiles reminded her that justice had finally arrived, but her heart remained weighed down by an invisible burden. Watching the harsh verdict fall upon the very men who had once seen themselves as rulers, Angela did not feel the satisfaction she had once imagined. Instead, a quiet emptiness crept into her soul, as if a part of her had been shattered, lost forever. That evening, Angela sat alone in her small room at the church, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm light across the space, yet unable to dispel the lingering exhaustion and unease. Her fingers unconsciously traced the cross on her necklace, now mended, yet the mark where it had been torn away remained, a scar that would never fade. Memories of her mother surfaced, clearer and more vivid than ever before. And in that moment, Angela understood that today's victory was not an ending, but the beginning of a much greater battle. The next morning, as the gentle light of dawn spread across the city, Angela returned to the impoverished neighborhood where she had first met Martha. The image of the elderly homeless woman, a former teacher who had once dedicated herself to the community, only to be abandoned by the very society she had served, struck a deep, painful chord in her heart. She looked around, taking in the sight of the homeless still gathered in the corners of the street, their eyes filled with weariness, guardedness, and quiet despair. In that moment, Angela realized that true change did not come solely from harsh sentences. It had to begin from within, in the hearts and minds of those willing to see beyond their own lives. With slow yet determined steps, she returned to the small church room where she and the other nuns often prepared meals for the needy. She sat down, inhaled deeply, and quietly wrote on a blank sheet of paper, "The Martha Foundation." It was more than just the name of the woman she had once helped. It was a symbol for the countless invisible lives, the silent victims of injustice, the ones who needed not just kindness, but a hand reaching out in their moments of hopelessness. In the days that followed, Angela took bolder steps. She no longer limited her efforts to providing food for the homeless. She began meeting with the community, listening to their stories, uncovering the pain they had long buried beneath silence. Those conversations made her realize that what had happened to her was not an isolated event. It was just a glimpse of a much larger, deeply ingrained problem. Angela decided she would no longer remain silent. She would speak, loudly and clearly, using her own story to shatter the silence that had endured for decades. Her choice quickly drew attention and widespread support. With each passing day, phone calls, emails, and messages poured in, fueling the momentum of her movement. The foundation didn't just provide material aid for those facing discrimination. It also offered free legal support and became a relentless voice pushing for systemic reform. It kept up unrelenting pressure, ensuring that injustices could no longer be swept under the rug. In the following weeks, Angela began appearing more frequently on television and at public forums. She told her story with strength and conviction, yet always with compassion, emphasizing that justice was not just about punishment. It was about transformation. It was about changing perceptions, educating and rebuilding the system from its very core. Her soft, yet unwavering voice resonated with thousands, igniting a determination in the public to ensure that men like Blake could no longer hide in the shadows. Within just a few months, the Martha Foundation for Justice had become a new symbol of equality, compassion, and the hope for true societal change. Waves of reform movements spread across the country, even reaching international platforms. Angela became more than just a survivor. She was now a voice, a leader who inspired not just with words but with action. Every day, she walked the streets, personally reaching out to people like Martha, those whom society had forgotten, those whom prejudice had pushed to the brink of despair. Standing on the podium at a major event organized by the foundation, Angela looked out at the crowd below, her eyes glowing with newfound hope. She was no longer just a victim, no longer someone oppressed by the system. She was a pioneer, a beacon for justice and change. The stage lights blazed, cameras flashed incessantly, but what made her heart race was not the attention. It was the memories she was about to share. These were stories she had long kept locked within her heart, memories of the discrimination she had faced. There were times she had felt utterly alone, lost, and on the verge of losing faith in human kindness. Yet, as Angela gazed into the thousands of eyes watching her, she spoke, her voice steady, soft, yet carrying the weight of truth. She recounted the day she chose to become a nun, not to escape the harsh realities of the world, but to confront them head-on, to become someone who spread the love and kindness her mother had always taught her. She spoke of the long days she had spent walking the streets, enduring the stares of suspicion, the cruel words whispered behind her back, and every time doubt crept in, she had held on to her mother's words. "My child, when the world is at its darkest, kindness is the only light that can shine through." Angela's closing words resonated through the vast hall, stirring the crowd to its core. No one is born a victim. No one is born a ruler. We do not fight for revenge. We fight to make this world fairer. A world where compassion triumphs over hatred, where justice does not cower before oppression. Our fight is only beginning, but I believe we will win, because justice never bows to tyranny. The audience erupted into thunderous applause. The lights illuminated Angela, no longer just a small, quiet nun, but a symbol of hope, a leader guiding an entire community toward a future where justice, kindness, and equality were no longer distant dreams, but a reality within reach. Her story spread like wildfire across the nation. Millions were moved, outraged, and awakened to a truth they had long ignored. From small neighborhoods to the largest cities, peaceful protests surged forward, filling the streets with chants for sweeping reform in the police system. Banners and placards carried powerful messages. Do not stay silent in the face of injustice. Angela is all of us. No one is above the law. Public pressure reached a boiling point, forcing both local and federal governments to act. Angela was no longer just a survivor. She had become a living symbol of courage, compassion, and relentless pursuit of justice. Even the most hardened politicians found themselves wary, for every word they spoke, every move they made, was now being scrutinized by millions who had finally found their voice. At City Hall, the fifth closed-door meeting of the week took place under an atmosphere heavier than ever before. Mayor Elaine Porter, a woman known for her political tact and ability to navigate controversial issues without taking a firm stance, sat silently at the conference table. Her gaze swept across the room, listening to the clashing arguments of her advisers. But this time, she knew there was no more room for avoidance. Outside, thousands of citizens gathered, awaiting her response. Their patience was running thin. The media was poised, ready to expose any sign of delay, any attempt to sidestep responsibility. She took a deep breath, then finally stood, stepping toward the window. Looking down at the sea of people, a genuine sense of apprehension stirred within her. The world outside was shifting, and she understood. If she did not change with it, she would be swept away like so many others who had tried to stand against the tide of justice. With a firm nod, she turned back to her advisers, her voice clear, unwavering. "It is time we face the truth. If we do not change now, the people will change us." The next day, at what was the most crucial press conference of her career, Mayor Elaine Porter stood before hundreds of cameras. Her voice was strong, resolute, yet the tension in her demeanor was unmistakable. "The city government acknowledges the failures in our management of the police force. From today onward, we are committing to a full-scale, transparent reform aimed at eradicating racial discrimination and abuse of power within our public security system. This is not a political promise. It is a direct commitment to action." She then announced an immediate series of bold measures: the dismissal of officers with a documented history of racial bias, the establishment of an independent oversight committee with active community participation, the mandatory use of body cameras for all officers, and, most significantly, a complete review of past cases suspected of racial profiling and police brutality. The speed of these decisions took even the most fervent protesters by surprise. For the first time, they could see undeniable proof that the will of the people had forced change upon a rigid, once untouchable power structure. In the days that followed, the city witnessed sweeping transformations unlike anything in its history. Officers with records of misconduct were suspended. Compulsory retraining programs in ethics and conflict resolution were implemented, and external third-party monitoring agencies were introduced to ensure transparency in law enforcement. Angela became a constant presence on television and social platforms, not just as a symbol of justice, but as an active overseer of the government's promises, reminding the public that their fight was far from over. Not everyone welcomed these reforms. Many police officers openly resisted, and political factions within the administration began making covert moves to protect their influence and maintain their power. But any effort to obstruct, delay, or counteract the reforms was quickly dismantled by the overwhelming pressure from public scrutiny and relentless media coverage. More critically, under the watchful supervision of federal military forces, backed directly by General Kenneth Turner, those who once believed themselves above the law found themselves resigning or being swiftly removed before they could mount any resistance. Day by day, the city began to see the first real signs of transformation. Young officers, those who had long endured the toxic culture within the force, began speaking out. The public's faith in justice, though fragile, slowly started to mend. More and more citizens stepped forward, eager to join community initiatives designed to aid the vulnerable and actively combat systemic injustice. At the largest public gathering since the movement began, Angela stood before a massive crowd stretching far beyond the square, her presence commanding the attention of every single person before her. As she spoke, her voice carried across the air, clear, unwavering, filled with the weight of truth and purpose. This is not just my fight. This is our opportunity, our responsibility, to build a society where no one is shackled by prejudice, where no one is denied justice because of the color of their skin. We have spoken. We have fought. And now we must continue forward. Justice is not just a word. Justice is action. A tidal wave of applause erupted, thundering across the square. The crowd, united in purpose, raised their voices, chanting in unison, "No more discrimination." But this was not just a slogan. It was a proclamation, a resounding declaration that a new era had begun, an era where no one could rise above the law, where no one could suppress the fundamental rights of another without facing the consequences. Once again, the unwavering power of compassion, resilience, and courage had cast out the darkness, opening a new chapter, not just for the city, but for all who had been silenced by injustice. Angela's story was no longer just a fight for justice. It had become a testament to the enduring strength of humanity, the power of kindness, the necessity of change, and the relentless pursuit of what is right. From a quiet nun, she had become a beacon of hope, an unstoppable force that inspired millions to rise against social injustice. And in the end, her journey left one undeniable question lingering in the hearts of all who listened. Can justice ever truly prevail if we remain silent in the face of injustice? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Two black twin boys were on their way home after basketball practice when they were stopped without cause by racist police officers. No reason, no evidence, just an excuse to intimidate. And when one officer pointed a gun at the head of one of the boys, he had no idea their mother wasn't an ordinary woman. She was Jennifer Aniston, a veteran Delta Force operative, a warrior who had survived the most dangerous battles. And when she uncovered a dark conspiracy aimed at wiping out young black men from the city, she knew she had to act. What will Jennifer do to protect her sons and bring down a rotten system? Who is really behind it all? Stay tuned until the end of the story to uncover the truth. Don't forget to comment where you're watching and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next thrilling stories. Jennifer Aniston stepped off the plane with a feeling both familiar and distant, her military boots making a soft sound on the tarmac while her heart weighed heavy with thoughts. After years of fighting in foreign lands where shadows always hid deadly threats, she had finally returned to the place she once called home. But her instincts as a soldier told her this place was no longer the same. The fiery sunset on the horizon cast long shadows over distant streets. The smell of exhaust mixed with the heavy scent of asphalt and sweat from a city that never truly slept. Standing on her homeland soil, she felt as though she were stepping onto a new battlefield, one without rifles, without enemies in headscarves, but full of wolves hiding in blue uniforms, men who believed they had absolute power over the lives of those they were sworn to protect. She hadn't come back to rest. No, someone like Jennifer Aniston had never truly known rest. She came back for the people who mattered most. Isaiah and Xavier, her twin sons, whom she had raised with everything she had. Not just a mother's love, but a soldier's toughness. At 16, they were tall, strong, with sharp eyes reflecting her spirit, resilience, determination, and a touch of caution toward the world around them. They were top students, excellent athletes, the kind of kids any parent would be proud of. But Jennifer knew well that grades and medals couldn't protect them from suspicious glances, from false excuses to be pulled into a broken justice system. She had taught them how to stay calm if they were stopped, how to keep their hands up, avoid sudden movements, speak clearly, and never argue, even when treated unfairly. But was that enough to keep them safe? She wasn't sure, because this city, under the rule of Sheriff Henry Whitaker, was no longer the place she once knew. Whitaker wasn't the kind of sheriff who cared about justice or protecting people. He was a strategist, a cunning fox who knew how to manipulate the system to build his army. A police force the people no longer trusted but feared. The officers under his command were no longer law enforcers. They were a repressive force ready to break anyone who dared resist. The senseless deaths of young black men increased every month, yet not one officer had been charged. Boys like Isaiah and Xavier didn't need to do anything wrong to be stopped, beaten, or even killed, just because they matched the description of some suspect. And if it happened, the system would justify it with a brief report. The suspect resisted. The officer had no choice but to open fire. Jennifer had read these reports from abroad, each one, every name. But reading about it and witnessing it were two different things. The moment she set foot in the city, she could feel the tension in the air, the silent fear spreading across every street corner. Black residents kept their heads down to avoid police stares. Groups of teenagers whispered about another baseless arrest. Parents' worried eyes followed their children off to school each morning, unsure whether they would return home safe. This city was no longer what she once knew, and that made her anger burn quietly, waiting to ignite. But no matter how things changed, Jennifer Aniston was never the type to back down from an enemy. She had fought on the battlefield and faced the most dangerous foes, but now her enemies didn't carry rifles or suicide vests. They wore badges and used the justice system as a legal weapon to kill. Jennifer knew if she didn't act, if she did nothing, one day Isaiah or Xavier's names would show up on the evening news, followed by empty justifications and hollow statements from the police department. She wouldn't let that happen. On the streets where Jennifer had grown up, the fear no longer came from criminals lurking in the dark, but from those tasked with upholding the law. And that night, as Isaiah and Xavier left the sports center after basketball practice, they had no idea a nightmare was waiting for them on the familiar sidewalk. The dim streetlights stretched long shadows along the pavement as the two boys walked, laughing about the game, their footsteps light like any other evening. But the slow hum of a patrol car behind them made them fall silent. No one said it out loud, but deep down, they both knew this was never a good sign. The car didn't drive past and move on. It suddenly sped up and cut them off, forcing them to stop. The doors swung open, and two officers stepped out. Officer Larson and Officer Keaton. Names not unfamiliar to the cautious whispers around the neighborhood. Men who didn't need a reason to turn a routine patrol into a nightmare for any black teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Freeze! Hands on your head!" Keaton barked, his hand resting on his holstered gun, his gaze full of judgment. Isaiah and Xavier glanced at each other, took a deep breath, and raised their hands, just like their mother had taught them since they were small. Don't give them an excuse. But they didn't need one, because Keaton had already made one up. "You two matched the description of suspects in an armed robbery 30 minutes ago. I don't think I need to tell you what happens next, right?" His voice was smug as he saw the boys freeze. Everyone knew what the description was. Any black boy walking the street at night. Isaiah gathered his courage, his voice steady from practice. "We just left practice. All our stuff is right here. You can check our bags if you need to." But that was exactly what Keaton was waiting for. He grabbed the bag, dumped out the books and sports clothes onto the ground, and nodded for Larson to do the same to Xavier. Textbooks, a water bottle rolled onto the street, nothing that could be tied to any robbery. But Larson's eyes remained ice cold. "Oh, really? 2 kids like you are just that innocent?" His tone curled in mockery, as if their very existence was an accusation. A few steps behind them, Officer Jenkins, a young rookie, swallowed hard as he watched. He'd heard plenty about how Keaton and Larson operated, but this was his first time seeing how predators hunted and created victims. Every part of him screamed that this was wrong, but Larson's sharp glance made him freeze. Fear of being seen as a traitor among the police kept him silent. Meanwhile, Keaton stepped closer, his eyes glinting with a cruel pleasure as he saw Isaiah's hands tremble slightly. "I don't think you're looking too good," he said with malice, before suddenly drawing his gun and pointing it at Isaiah's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. The moment dragged on like a nightmare. There was no way Isaiah could escape in time, nowhere to run, and he knew the next second could be his last. A nearby citizen, horrified, pulled out their phone and began recording. But Keaton didn't seem to care. He knew a video might not change anything. But just as the gunshot was about to ring out, an authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Drop the weapon now!" From another patrol car that had just arrived, Lieutenant Matthew Caldwell stepped out, his sharp eyes taking in the entire scene. He wasn't like Keaton or Larson, but he wasn't the type to take a stand for what was right, either. He was a man who followed orders, and this situation could cause problems for the department. Keaton clenched his jaw, but seeing the camera phone and Caldwell's disapproving stare, he reluctantly lowered his weapon. "Just following procedure, Lieutenant," he sneered in defense, but everyone knew he had come dangerously close to killing an innocent boy. Isaiah and Xavier stayed frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had nearly lost their lives in a power game without rules. And even though no one pulled the trigger, the fear remained, burned into their minds. A reminder that in this city, their lives were never truly safe. When Isaiah and Xavier walked into the house that night, the silence in the living room was so heavy it was almost tangible. Jennifer turned her head, her sharp gaze sweeping over her two sons, quickly checking to see if they were hurt. But what made her truly furious was the fear still etched clearly on both their faces. She didn't need to hear the details to know the worst had almost happened. When Isaiah began to recount everything, his voice still carried a faint tremble despite his effort to stay calm. Jennifer didn't interrupt, but her hand clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had seen too much violence, had watched comrades fall in distant wars, but never had she felt so angry and helpless as she did now. Her sons, innocent children, had nearly been killed by the very people who called themselves enforcers of justice. On the battlefield, there were rules: a clear enemy, a clear mission, a clear objective. But here, the enemy didn't wear a different uniform, didn't stand on the opposite side. They wore the mask of law, hunted their prey in the dark, under the pretense of protection. Jennifer knew if Isaiah and Xavier had appeared on the news tonight, they would have been labeled suspects, and their deaths would have been buried under an internal report full of meaningless phrases like "felt threatened" and "dangerous situation." She had fought for America for years, but had America ever truly fought for children like hers? Jennifer's fury didn't explode uncontrollably. Instead, it took root in a cold and calculated resolve. If this system wanted her sons silent, she would become the voice they couldn't silence. Jennifer wasn't the type to wait for justice to arrive. She would take down the ones who had turned this city into another war zone herself. In the dead of night, Jennifer sat in front of her computer, her fingers moving swiftly through data files and databases no ordinary citizen could access. With her Delta Force training in intelligence gathering, she knew every corrupt player had a weakness. No one had yet dared to exploit it. Larson and Keaton weren't just violent officers. They had escaped countless allegations thanks to high-level connections. But more importantly, The one protecting them was none other than Sheriff Henry Whitaker. Under his command, police brutality cases had spiked, internal complaints disappeared into thin air, and black victims were repeatedly accused of baseless crimes. Jennifer dug deeper, and when she found Project Sentinel, her fingers froze on the keyboard. What appeared on the screen made her breath slow. This wasn't just a rotten police department. It was a systematic plan. Project Sentinel wasn't just about abuse or wrongful arrests. It was a carefully orchestrated purge campaign disguised under the label of urban crime control. Its goal was to gradually eliminate young black men from the city through mass incarceration, baseless violence, or, when necessary, permanent removals of anyone who might become a problem in the future. Whitaker couldn't have created this alone. Someone was behind him. A force bigger and more powerful. The funding for Project Sentinel didn't come from the city's budget, but from real estate developers and politicians who wanted to clean up the city their way. Jennifer understood immediately. This was far beyond the police department. It was an economic and political conspiracy, and black children like Isaiah and Xavier were nothing more than sacrifices for that plan. She needed an ally, someone who understood the dark world of law enforcement and dirty politics. Without hesitation, Jennifer picked up the phone and called a number she hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a deep, solid voice came through. "Jennifer Aniston. Long time." "Ryan Ellis," Jennifer replied, her voice cold as steel. "I need you." A sigh came over the line, but there was no surprise. "I'm guessing this is big. Where do we meet?" Jennifer glanced one last time at her computer screen, where the Project Sentinel file remained open, Whitaker's name glowing like a warning sign. She smirked, her eyes glinting with the ruthless determination of someone ready for war. "Where we swore we'd never go back to. The heart of the front line." As Jennifer put down the phone, her gaze never left the screen, where Henry Whitaker's name glared like a warning. She knew she had crossed the danger line, and that meant her enemies wouldn't sit still. In a place like this city, truth was never allowed to come out without consequences, and men like Whitaker never let anyone threaten their power without retaliation. The question wasn't if he would act, but when and how. And Jennifer had no intention of waiting to be taken down. She started preparing. On the other side of the city, in an office filled with cigarette smoke, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he listened to Larson and Keaton's report. "She knows too much," Larson said, his voice tense. "And if she keeps digging, the whole plan will be exposed." Whitaker stayed silent for a few seconds, then set his cigar down, his gaze glinting with ruthless coldness. "We've given her too much space," he said slowly. "This can't drag on any longer." He glanced at Keaton. "You know what to do?" Keaton nodded, his smile curling up like he'd been waiting for this order. A cold wind blew through the night as a four-man team dressed in black silently approached Jennifer's house. They left their car lights off, made no sound except for boots pressing into damp grass. This wasn't a routine patrol unit. They were a specially selected SWAT team meant to clean up problems Whitaker didn't want to be publicly tied to. Silenced weapons in hand, they weren't there to arrest. They were there to kill. Keaton led the way, signaling his team to split up according to plan. Everything was perfect, smooth. No sign of resistance from inside. The front door was unlocked. Jennifer's mistake? He pushed the door open gently with the barrel of his gun, stepping into the pitch-dark house. And then it all collapsed in an instant. A smoke bomb exploded the moment he crossed the threshold, filling the house with thick fog. Shouts erupted as the others stepped into the trap, their vision gone. Before they could react, Jennifer's shadow was already moving. She struck like the wind, using every second of their disorientation. A precise blow to the throat dropped the first man immediately. The second failed, but was pinned by Jennifer and slammed hard against the wall, knocking him out cold. Only Keaton and one other remained, desperately trying to find her in the smoke. He fired blindly, but she was no longer there. She used every shadow, every gap, every second of their panic, taking out the third with a spinning kick to the temple. Only Keaton was left. He was gasping for air, gripping his weapon tight, spinning in circles looking for her. "Come out, bitch!" he snarled. But his voice betrayed his fear. "You thought it would be easier, didn't you?" Jennifer's voice cut through the fog, cold as steel. "You thought I was just another helpless mother waiting for you to come kill me?" Keaton turned, gun raised, but Jennifer was already behind him, locking her solid arms around his neck and choking him tight. Keaton thrashed violently, but Jennifer held him in a precise chokehold, using all her strength to bring him down. Seconds later, he faded into unconsciousness. When the smoke cleared, 4 officers lay scattered across the floor, unconscious but alive. Jennifer hadn't killed them. She wanted them to know she could have, but chose not to, because she wasn't like them. But among them, one man remained awake, staring at her with fear and confusion. Officer Jenkins. Jennifer stared down at him, her eyes icy cold. "What are you doing here?" Jenkins swallowed hard, raising his hands in surrender. I'm not like them," he stammered. "I didn't want this to happen, but if I refused to join, they said they'd kill me." Jennifer narrowed her eyes, assessing him for a moment. She could see his fear wasn't of her, but of those who controlled everything from the shadows. "Whitaker?" Jenkins shuddered, then shook his head. "Not just him. Whitaker's just a pawn. Someone else is behind this, someone bigger. I don't know who they are, but they're not just cops. They have money, power, and they're not just controlling this city. They have people in government protecting them." Jennifer stayed silent, but inside, her rage boiled over. These people didn't just want to destroy kids like Isaiah and Xavier. They were running an organized purge, and Whitaker was just the tip of the iceberg. But Jenkins wasn't finished. "You need to know this," he said, his voice shaking. "You're not just fighting the police, Jennifer. You're fighting an organization that's been planning this for a long time. And if you keep going," he swallowed hard, "they won't just kill you. They'll wipe out anyone who dares to stand against them." Jennifer stared at him, then leaned down, grabbed his collar, and pulled him close. "Then they'll regret not killing me from the start." And with fire blazing in her eyes, Jennifer knew. The real war had only just begun. Jennifer didn't sleep that night. She sat in the small room, the glow from the computer screen casting sharp light over her determined face. Line by line, data on Project Sentinel was slowly coming together, forming a complete picture. It was clear as day now. Whitaker wasn't the only one behind this plan. But to bring down an entire corrupt and brutal system, she needed more than names and scattered data. She needed justice exposed to the public eye. And to do that, she needed someone who could bring the truth into the light. There was only one person fit for that task: Marcus Kane. Marcus was no stranger to high-level corruption cases. He had already taken down dirty politicians, corporations that concealed crimes, and powerful figures who believed the law couldn't touch them. But that also meant Marcus was always on someone's hit list. And if Whitaker, or the ones above him, discovered he was digging into Project Sentinel, he wouldn't have much time left. Jennifer met Marcus at a small cafe deep in the neighborhood, a place with no security cameras and no curious eyes. When he walked in, she could see the alertness in his gaze. Marcus wasn't someone who trusted easily, but when she placed a USB drive in front of him, containing all the evidence on Project Sentinel, She knew he wouldn't be able to look away. "This isn't just an internal police plan," Jennifer said, her voice low and razor-sharp. "It has backing from above. Politicians, corporations, maybe even the state government. They're turning boys like Isaiah and Xavier into targets for elimination. If they're not killed on the streets, they'll be imprisoned for life. And if they're not imprisoned, they'll disappear." Marcus flipped through the documents, his face darkening. "Jesus," he muttered. "If this gets out, it won't just rock the city. It'll shake the entire country." Jennifer nodded. "Exactly. The question is, do you have the guts to do it?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared at the data in front of him, his eyes flashing with anger. Then, after a deep breath, he nodded. "I'll do it." But they were already waiting for him. Less than 24 hours after he met with Jennifer, Marcus vanished. His phone was unreachable, his emails went unanswered, and when Jennifer went to his house, the door had been busted in, the inside torn apart with clear signs of a struggle. She didn't need to guess what had happened. Whitaker, or whoever was behind him, had made their move first. Jennifer didn't waste time hesitating. She followed the few clues Marcus had left behind in his apartment. A smashed laptop, but the hard drive intact. A torn page noting a meeting Marcus hadn't gotten a chance to cancel. And most important of all, a small tracking device attached to his phone. They had been watching him from the start. The last recorded data led to an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, a place known to be a secret police torture site for those who didn't cooperate. Jennifer had no intention of letting Marcus become another nameless body. She armed herself with a silenced pistol, tactical knives, and a compact hacking kit. She couldn't afford to leave any traces behind. By the time Jennifer approached the warehouse, night had already fallen. But she wasn't alone. A small team of mercenaries hired by the police was guarding the perimeter. By the way, they moved. She knew they weren't regular cops. These were professionals, trained killers who didn't ask questions. She couldn't storm the place head-on. She had to do it her way. Jennifer crawled along the wall, using the shadows to get close to one of the guards. In a move as fast as lightning, she dragged him into a blind spot, covered his mouth, and took him out with a precise strike, knocking him unconscious immediately. Then she wired his earpiece into their internal radio system. Now she could hear them. Inside, Marcus was tied to a chair, blood running from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were still full of defiance. Standing in front of him was Whitaker, slowly circling like a predator. "You thought you could get this out," Whitaker sneered. "Don't you understand how the world works, Kane? Justice isn't for everyone, and you made the mistake of thinking you could change that." Marcus gave a weak chuckle, spitting blood onto the floor. "That's what you bastards want all of us to believe. But here's the thing, Whitaker. I don't believe you." Whitaker clenched his jaw and drew his gun. But before he could do anything, the lights cut out. Jennifer acted the moment chaos erupted. She threw a smoke grenade into the room, using infrared vision to find Marcus. The mercenaries fired blindly into the darkness, but Jennifer was everywhere and nowhere. She moved fast, taking them down one by one, until only Whitaker remained, panicked, gun shaking in his hands. As the smoke cleared, he saw Jennifer standing right in front of him, gun aimed at his head. "The game's over, Whitaker," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. But Whitaker didn't show fear. He laughed, though his breathing was shaky. "You think I'm the one pulling the strings?" He narrowed his eyes, as if enjoying the flash of surprise in hers. "I'm just a pawn in the game, Aniston. You've stepped into a war you don't even understand." Jennifer gritted her teeth. "Then who's behind it?" Whitaker smirked. "You'll find out soon enough, and when you do, you'll wish you never started this." Jennifer stared at him, then, without hesitation, punched him hard, knocking him to the floor. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jennifer stood in the dark room, the streetlights outside casting sharp lines across her face. Whitaker had been taken down, but his final words echoed in her head like a warning bell. He was only a pawn. Someone like Whitaker couldn't run an operation as large as Project Sentinel alone. The sheriff might have been the enforcer, but the true orders came from higher up, somewhere far beyond, where real power dictated people's fates. She turned to Marcus, who was wiping the blood from his forehead with a damp cloth. "Have you ever heard the name Richard Davenport?" Marcus looked up, his eyes flashing dangerously. "The governor?" Jennifer nodded. "I trace the funding for Project Sentinel. Most of it doesn't come from the city budget. It comes from private investment funds. But the largest source, a fund approved directly by the governor's office." Marcus sighed, flipping open his laptop and starting to search. Davenport's always been considered one of the most powerful politicians in the state. He's got ties to major real estate developers, and since taking office, he's pushed for continuous urban redevelopment projects. If he's involved in Project Sentinel, his goal isn't just about fighting crime. Jennifer crossed her arms, her eyes cold.
No, he wants to wipe out an entire community.
Marcus turned his screen toward her, showing a series of plans for new urban development projects, high-rise buildings, shopping centers, luxury hotels, all located exactly where black residential communities now stood. "This is the real reason," Marcus said. "Davenport doesn't just want to eliminate crime. He wants to erase black people from this city. If they're not killed, they'll be imprisoned. If they're not imprisoned, they'll be forced out when their homes are demolished, their incomes cut off. This whole area will become a luxury district only the wealthy can afford." Jennifer clenched her fists. This wasn't a random plan or a single conspiracy. It was a ruthless system, supported by those at the very top of government. "So how do we take him down?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with despair. "He's got an entire political machine behind him. He controls the media. If we just release the evidence, he'll bury it before the public even reacts." Jennifer took a deep breath, her eyes darkening as strategic thoughts began to line up in her mind. "We can't just attack him from one direction. We have to bring down the entire system protecting him." Marcus stared at her. "What do you mean?" Jennifer turned away, her gaze fixed on the city lights in the distance. "Whitaker was just the executioner. He's easily replaced. If Davenport feels pressured, he'll sacrifice Whitaker and install someone else. We need something even he can't deny." Marcus slowly nodded. "Evidence isn't enough. We need a major event. We need the public to rise. We need to strip him of power in front of his backers." Jennifer turned back, her eyes blazing. "Exactly. We're going to break the entire rotten political machine. And we start by making Davenport the center of a public investigation he can't escape." Marcus gave a wry smile. "You think you can take down a governor?" Jennifer tilted her head slightly, a sharp smile on her lips. "I've dismantled terrorist networks in war zones thousands of miles away. Davenport? He's just another mission." Jennifer had always believed in strategy, in controlling every variable before making a move. But even the most perfect strategies had weak points, and she had just discovered a serious flaw in hers. Since Whitaker had been taken down, the enemy had quickly changed tactics. No longer blatant attacks or brazen ambushes, but subtler, more sophisticated moves. The ones behind Project Sentinel weren't just corrupt cops or unethical corporations. They were people with political power, and people like that always knew how to gather intel before striking. That meant there was a traitor in her team. Jennifer realized this when one of the safe houses she had set up with Marcus was somehow discovered. It was a secret location, known only to the most trusted members of her team. And yet, less than 48 hours later, a mysterious special ops group had surrounded the place. If she and Marcus hadn't left earlier than planned, they could have been wiped out instantly. That wasn't a coincidence. Jennifer didn't believe in coincidence in war. She spent the entire night reviewing communications, double-checking everyone who had participated in the mission, analyzing even the smallest moves. Someone in her team had betrayed her. The list of suspects wasn't long. Jennifer's team wasn't a large organization, just a small group of fighters she trusted. Marcus Kane, the journalist. He couldn't be the spy. He had too much to lose. If the plan failed. Ryan Ellis, the former intelligence officer trained to catch spies, not become. 1. Mason Trent, ex-Navy SEAL, who had been in every fight alongside her. Tyler Briggs, a genius hacker who had helped her disable the police security systems. Daryl Sloan, a professional sniper who always provided cover from a distance. Among them, only one had acted suspiciously. Jennifer went back through the encrypted message logs they had used to communicate. One message stood out, a message from Tyler Briggs sent at 2 a.m., containing nothing but a string of meaningless characters. But Jennifer knew, in the world of espionage, there was no such thing as a meaningless message. She started tracing it, and then she found the truth. Tyler had sent information about their location to an unidentified device, a device linked to the police's internal system. He was the traitor. Jennifer didn't confront him right away. She was a warrior, not someone reckless. She knew if Tyler was working for Whitaker or whoever was behind him, he'd still be in contact with them. And that was when she would make her move. She set up a fake signal trap, a falsified encrypted message about a critical upcoming meeting with a new contact. If Tyler was the spy, he'd send the message along. And as expected, he took the bait. Jennifer confronted him that night, in a sealed room with no exit. Tyler tried to act as if nothing was wrong, but she could see the beads of sweat on his forehead, hear his irregular breathing as she tossed his phone onto the table, its screen showing every message he had sent to Whitaker. "So it's you," Jennifer said, her voice low and dangerous. Tyler took a deep breath, then suddenly lunged, pulling a knife from his belt. But he didn't understand one thing. Jennifer Aniston wasn't an opponent he could overpower. In 3 seconds, she had locked his wrist, disarmed him, and slammed him to the floor with a brutal throw. Tyler groaned in pain, struggling to get free, but Jennifer tightened her grip, rendering him helpless. "Who are you working for?" she growled, squeezing tighter, enough to make him feel his life hanging by a thread. Tyler coughed, trying to speak between ragged breaths. Not Whitaker." Jennifer paused a second. "Keep talking." "Davenport," Tyler gasped. "Whitaker's just a pawn. Davenport's the one running everything. He knows your plan. And now he's ready to end it all." Jennifer stared at him, then released him, letting him collapse to the floor in a heavy, gasping breath. He wasn't the problem anymore. But what he had just revealed changed everything. Davenport knew she was coming. This wasn't a covert war anymore. It had become an open battle. Jennifer stood up, her eyes burning as she stared out the window. If Davenport wanted a fight, she would bring the war right to his doorstep. Jennifer knew this battle had entered a new phase. Davenport was no longer hiding in the shadows, and Whitaker, still loyal to the commands from above, remained a dangerous piece on the board. But Jennifer hadn't expected him to strike so fast. Less than 24 hours after rooting out the traitor in her team, Jennifer received a message that left no room for doubt. "We have your son. If you want him alive, come alone." She stared at the phone screen, a cold chill running down her spine. Isaiah, one of the most precious things in her life, had been taken. The last time Jennifer saw Isaiah, he and Xavier had been studying combat plans she'd taught them, eager to be part of the fight. But now he was in enemy hands, and they knew Jennifer wouldn't stand idly by. Whitaker had survived his downfall. He no longer held power within the police department, but that didn't mean he had lost the loyalty of those who shared his cause. Men ready to do anything to see Jennifer Aniston destroyed. He wanted her to surrender. But Jennifer wasn't the type to yield. When she arrived at the location Whitaker specified, an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, she didn't come unprepared. Jennifer went alone, as he demanded, but in her mind, the real battle had started long before she set foot there. Whitaker was waiting, a mocking smile on his face as Jennifer stepped out of the shadows. He stood in the middle of a heavily armed group, a far cry from a legitimate sheriff, and right next to him, Isaiah knelt on the cold concrete, his hands bound, his face bruised. But when he saw his mother, he didn't show fear. His eyes lit up with steady trust. He knew his mother wouldn't come without a plan. Jennifer stopped a few meters from Whitaker, her voice calm and terrifyingly steady. "You've gone too far, Whitaker." Whitaker sneered. "You're right, Jennifer. I've gone too far. And so have you. You think you can bring down this entire system? You think you can take out Davenport and turn this whole city upside down?" He grabbed Isaiah by the hair, yanking hard, making him grit his teeth in pain. "You forgot something, Jennifer. You're not invincible. You're human, and humans have weaknesses." Jennifer's gaze remained cold. "And you think my weakness is my son?" Whitaker tilted his head, his grin widening. "What are you going to do, Agent Aniston? Surrender and take a bullet in the head, or watch this kid die right in front of you?" She was silent for a moment, then slowly raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Let him go," she said evenly. "I'll do whatever you want." Whitaker raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. He hadn't thought Jennifer Aniston would surrender so easily, but he also knew she wasn't simple. He lowered his voice, cautious. "What's your play?" Jennifer gave a cold smile. "You'll find out soon enough." And then, a blast rocked the warehouse. Whitaker's team was under assault before they could react. From a distance, Jennifer's remaining team had been waiting, triggering a series of explosions targeting Whitaker's headquarters, where he kept the remaining files on Project Sentinel. All evidence of what he'd done was being wiped out right in front of him. But Jennifer wasn't finished. Before Whitaker could pull his gun, Jennifer lunged, landing a punch so powerful it sent him staggering back, dropping Isaiah. She gave him no time to recover. A sweeping kick, a straight punch to the jaw, a flawless chokehold. In less than 10 seconds, Whitaker lay at her feet, gasping, his face contorted with pain and fear. She leaned in, whispering in his ear, "You thought I'd come without a plan?" He wheezed, his eyes wide. You won't get away with this." Jennifer clenched her teeth, her voice low, a promise of destruction. "I'm not here to get away. I'm here to destroy everything you built." When Jennifer's team arrived, they quickly secured the remaining gunmen, rescued Isaiah, and left the scene before rapid response forces arrived. Jennifer didn't kill Whitaker. He didn't deserve a quick death. She left him there, in the ruins of the system he thought was untouchable, and as he gasped for air, watching the flames rise from his former headquarters, he realized one thing. Jennifer Aniston wasn't just someone seeking revenge. She was the nightmare they had foolishly awakened. The fire still smoldered from the explosion at Whitaker's old headquarters, but Jennifer knew the battle wasn't over. He was still alive, a wounded snake, not yet dead, and as long as he was breathing, he remained a threat. With nowhere else to hide, Whitaker retreated to police headquarters, where his last loyal officers remained, the ones who had operated Project Sentinel with him from the shadows. But Jennifer wasn't going to give him the chance to regroup. She intended to end this tonight, and she would strike straight at his lair. She stood with her team in a dark alleyway, facing the fortified police station. Searchlights swept across the night sky as if hunting anyone daring to trespass on Whitaker's domain. But Jennifer wasn't an intruder. She was here to reclaim justice. She glanced around at her team: Marcus Kane, Ryan Ellis, Mason Trent, Daryl Sloan, each ready for combat. They had no other choice. If they didn't finish this tonight, Davenport would send someone else to replace Whitaker, and everything would return to how it was. Jennifer clenched her fists. She wouldn't let that happen. They attacked just before dawn. Daryl Sloan fired the first shots, taking out the rooftop snipers. His precise marksmanship crippled the station's defenses within seconds. Marcus and Mason breached from the rear, using signal jammers to disable the police communication system. All Whitaker could see from his control room was a blank screen, alarms blaring, but no reports coming through. And in the chaos, Jennifer Aniston moved in. She slipped through the darkness like a nightmare. Each corrupt officer under Whitaker was taken down, ruthlessly and with precision. Those who resisted were subdued immediately. Those who tried to run were dropped by Daryl before they could reach the back exit. The police inside the building never expected their headquarters to become the battleground for the one person they thought was easy prey. Jennifer didn't stop. She headed straight for Whitaker's office, where he was waiting, like a cornered animal. When the door burst open, she found him standing in the center of the room, gun pointed at Isaiah's head. Isaiah was tied to a chair, cold sweat on his forehead, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't afraid. He knew his mother wouldn't let him be hurt. Whitaker smirked, the last shred of confidence on his sweat-soaked face. "You think you can walk in here and end it just like that?" Jennifer stood still, her voice low and cold. "I didn't come here to negotiate, Whitaker. I came to the end this." He laughed loudly, but Jennifer could see the tremor in his gun hand. "You're out of options, Aniston. If I die, this kid dies with me." And then a gunshot rang out. Whitaker didn't even realize what had happened. He stumbled forward, his hand shaking as the gun slipped from his fingers. His eyes went wide with shock. A bullet had ripped through his back, piercing clean through him from behind. Jennifer turned toward the doorway. Xavier was standing there, gun in hand, smoke still rising from the barrel. His voice was steady and firm. "You'll never threaten my family again." Whitaker staggered, trying to say something, but he no longer had the strength. He collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. In his final moments, his eyes were filled with panic. He had underestimated Jennifer Aniston, and now he was paying with his life. Jennifer didn't spare him another glance. She rushed to Isaiah, cutting the ropes that bound him and pulling him into her arms. Isaiah clung to her tightly, feeling her strong heartbeat, knowing they had won. She turned to Xavier, who still held the gun, his hands gripping it tightly, the weight of his first shot lingering. Jennifer placed a hand on his shoulder, acknowledgement and reassurance. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice softer but still firm. "And now, we finish the rest." Outside, police sirens wailed. But this time, they weren't corrupt. They were the honest officers, the ones who had waited for the moment to take down a rotten system. Jennifer looked around, knowing this fight wasn't over yet. But at least one of the worst had been removed from the board. She squeezed her son's shoulders, and for the first time in years, she felt hope. The red and blue lights from police cars and federal agents flashed across police headquarters, reflecting off bloodstains that still marred the cold concrete floor. Jennifer stood in the middle of the chaos, her hands still gripping her weapon, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline still surging through her veins. Whitaker was eliminated, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The armored vehicle's doors swung open, and FBI agents in tactical gear stormed in, taking control of the entire area. They didn't need Jennifer's command. They already knew what was happening. Tonight's battle wasn't just another raid. It was the death knell for an entire corrupt system that had ruled the city for too long. Senior Agent Ethan Lawson, who had been secretly tracking the police corruption scandal for years, stepped out of an armored SUV. His eyes scanned the scene like someone witnessing the end of an empire. "It's been a long time since I've seen a purge this big," Lawson said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of approval. "Well done, Aniston." Jennifer didn't reply right away. She looked around. Corrupt officers in handcuffs, men who once believed themselves untouchable, now just trembling shadows among the wreckage. Their uniforms no longer shielded them. Their badges no longer protected them. Justice had arrived. But one man was still missing. Davenport. He wasn't here. Jennifer knew someone like him wasn't foolish. The moment Whitaker went down, Davenport would have realized the wave was coming for him. A powerful politician like Davenport always had an escape route, always had a contingency plan for the worst day. Marcus Kane approached from behind, holding a laptop, its code still running non-stop. "I tracked his bank accounts," he said, his face tense. "Davenport emptied all his funds in the last 12 hours and chartered a private jet." Jennifer frowned. "Destination?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Mexico. But he's not taking a standard route. I think he's making a stopover." Jennifer narrowed her eyes. A man capable of running an operation like Project Sentinel wasn't just a corrupt politician. He couldn't have done it alone. He had allies, people more powerful backing him. And now, he was trying to run back to them. But he had made a mistake. He left a trail, and Jennifer wouldn't let him escape. She turned to Agent Lawson, her voice firm. "I need a team to track him." Lawson raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Davenport's a big fish. If we catch him, we might expose the entire system behind him." Jennifer nodded. "Then we have to catch him before he disappears." Lawson pressed a button on his radio. "Task Force, deploy immediately. Target, Richard Davenport. Don't let him leave the country." A response came back instantly from the other side. "Copy. Alpha Team is approaching the private airfield now." Jennifer looked up at the night sky, where FBI helicopters were already lifting off, heading toward where Davenport thought he could escape. But he was wrong. Jennifer Aniston was coming. The night sky was torn apart by the roar of FBI helicopters, searchlights sweeping across the runway of the private airfield, where Richard Davenport was trying to escape. Jennifer and the tactical team rushed forward, their hurried footsteps blending with the blaring alarms echoing throughout the area. It seemed like everything was coming to an end. But war was never that simple. As they neared the runway, gunfire erupted from hidden corners. Davenport wasn't alone. He had prepared a group of mercenaries, men paid to protect him to the end. Bullets rained down like a storm of steel, forcing Jennifer's team to dive behind cargo crates for cover. "We can't let him get on that plane!" Marcus shouted over the radio. Jennifer gripped her weapon tightly, squeezed the trigger, and took down a gunman advancing toward them. She could see him, Davenport, moving swiftly toward the private jet, his expensive suit whipping in the night wind. "Move up!" she ordered, breaking from cover. She sprinted straight toward Davenport, pouring every ounce of strength into each step, knowing this might be the deciding moment. But then a shot rang out. Jennifer didn't feel the bullet, but she heard the scream. She turned and saw Captain Ryan Ellis, her most loyal teammate, collapse to the ground, blood spreading across his chest. "Ryan!" she screamed, rushing toward him, forgetting everything else for that moment. Ryan lay there, his breath shallow, his eyes still bright, but his body quickly losing strength. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding, but deep down she knew it was too late. He gave a faint smile, one she never wanted to see on the face of someone she cared for. "Jennifer, don't stop," he said, his voice broken, struggling to get out each word. "Finish this, for all of us." Jennifer shook her head, her eyes burning. "You're going to be fine, Ryan. We'll get you out of here." But Ryan knew the truth better than anyone. He gave her one last look, one that held everything he had never said, and then he exhaled his final breath. Jennifer's world shattered. She sat there, mind blank, while the gunfire continued around her. Davenport had already boarded the plane. She no longer cared. Everything she had fought for, justice, truth, family, teammates, seemed meaningless now that Ryan was gone. A hand rested on her shoulder. Jennifer turned and saw Isaiah staring at her, his eyes burning with determination. "Mom, you can't stop!" She opened her mouth to protest, but Xavier was already beside her, his eyes filled with deep pain, yet with no hesitation. "You started this fight," Xavier said, his voice strong despite a slight tremble. "You can't quit when we're so close to winning." Jennifer took a shaky breath, looking at her sons. They were grown. They had lived through horror, but they hadn't broken. They stood strong and pulled their mother up with them. She looked back at Ryan, feeling the deep pain inside her, but also another truth. He had sacrificed himself so she could keep going. If she gave up now, his death would be meaningless. She clenched her fists, the sorrow in her eyes replaced with a new fire. Davenport thought he could run, but he didn't realize what he had just unleashed. Jennifer Aniston will never stop. FBI helicopters still circled in the night sky, searchlights sweeping across the border area. On the ground, agents moved like shadows, combing the scene, inspecting every fragment of the downed plane. But Jennifer didn't need a report to know the truth. Richard Davenport was gone. The wreckage smoked, the fuselage twisted into useless metal, but there was no body inside. Not a charred bone, not a single piece of evidence proving he had died in the crash. Only a space, as if he had never been on board. Jennifer stood in the ruin, a creeping unease settling into her every muscle. Davenport wasn't the type to die so easily, and if he had found a way to escape, it meant he had planned it long before. This wasn't over. As Jennifer's team withdrew from the scene, her phone suddenly vibrated. An unknown number, no name displayed. She stopped walking, feeling the cold wind brush the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her from the darkness. She opened the phone and saw a single message. "You think you've won? The game has only just begun." She instantly took a screenshot, but within seconds, the message auto-deleted. No trace, no history, no way to track its origin. Marcus Kane, standing beside her, noticed her reaction and frowned. "What is it?" Jennifer tightened her grip on the phone, her eyes sharp. "Someone else is behind all of this." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You think it's Davenport?" Jennifer shook her head.
No.
"He's not that good at hiding. If he was alive, he wouldn't send this message anonymously. This is someone else, someone more powerful, smarter." Ryan Ellis, still recovering from his wounds, stepped forward. He glanced at Jennifer's phone. "Think about the big picture," he said. "We tracked down Whitaker, then Davenport, but they were both following orders. They didn't create Project Sentinel." Marcus nodded, frowning deeply. Exactly. A plan like this needs funding, political connections, and most importantly, a mastermind controlling everything. Jennifer took a deep breath, hands clasped behind her back, thinking like a strategist on a battlefield. The question is, who? They returned to the safe house, where Xavier and Isaiah were waiting. The two boys saw their mother walk in with a new kind of resolve, an iron determination they hadn't seen before. Isaiah spoke immediately. "What's wrong, Mom?" Jennifer didn't want to hide the truth from her sons. She sighed, took off her bullet-riddled jacket, and laid it over a chair. Then she set it straight. Davenport was never the mastermind. Both Xavier and Isaiah fell silent. Xavier was the first to break it. Then who? Who's really behind all this? Jennifer turned to Marcus. "Can you trace the message?" Marcus sat at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I can try, but if it was sent through a high-level secure system, it probably bounced through hundreds of servers to cover its tracks." He typed a string of commands, eyes locked on the screen as lines of code streamed by. 1 minute passed, then 2, and suddenly, a set of coordinates appeared. Marcus stopped typing, his brow furrowing. "I've got a signal, but it's not from within the country." He turned to Jennifer, his voice full of suspicion. "It's coming from an island over 300 miles offshore." Jennifer frowned. A hidden base? Ryan Ellis stood with his arms crossed, thinking for a moment. A group like this wouldn't leak information easily. If we found these coordinates, it means either they're confident they can't be touched, or they want us to come. Jennifer didn't like the feeling. She'd fallen into traps on the battlefield before, and this could be another. But at the same time, it was the only lead they had. She clenched her fists, something igniting deep inside her. A familiar feeling, a fury boiling in her veins. "They think they can control us like pawns," she said, her voice low and cold. "But this time, they're the ones being hunted." Jennifer Aniston was ready for the final battle. Whoever sent that message thought the game had just begun. But Jennifer wasn't here to play games. She was here to end them. Jennifer Aniston had toppled an entire corrupt police system, faced the most powerful enemies, and paid for it with the blood of her teammates. But when she thought it was over, an even more dangerous force was waiting in the shadows. Will Jennifer be able to track down and eliminate the true mastermind? Or is this only the tip of an even larger conspiracy? Who do you think is really behind Project Sentinel? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you love this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Jennifer's journey isn't over yet, and you won't want to miss what's coming.